Hey everyone, Nick Marzinski here at TrappingLight.com, and today I want to finish out the black and white conversion tutorials by talking about toning an image. And when we're talking about toning an image, what I mean is that we're going to be altering the hue and the saturation of the entire image. We'll be adding a color cast to it, either a sepia color or a cyanotype color or anything like that, where we'll actually be just simply washing the image with a specific color. Now, what we're not changing when we tone an image, we don't want to change the luminosity of the image, the brightness of the image. We've already dealt with that in a prior tutorial, and once you get to the point where you're toning an image, which is generally the last step in a black and white conversion process, or at least one of the last steps, you've already set the brightness. And so toning is not about brightness, it's simply about adding a hue and deciding how much saturation of that hue that you want to add to the image. And Photoshop Elements provide several tools that can be used to tone any image, not just a black and white image, but any image. So let's get to it. I've got the black and white image that I've been working with over the last several tutorials up, and I've made all of my adjustments using my gradient map to desaturate the image and add a lot of contrast to that desaturation. And then I also have my hue and saturation layer below my gradient map, which I've used to darken the reds as well as boost the brightness on the yellows and the greens, which would be the trees and the leaves in the trees up here, and the reds darkened the trail somewhat because a lot of the color here was in the reds from the clay of the trail as well as the leaves on the floor of the trail. So now all of the brightness stuff has been done, the black and white conversion's been done. Now I want to tone this image. And here's a few ways to do it. The first way and the easiest way is to simply use a photo filter adjustment layer. You just go click on photo filter and it brings up a pretty simple properties menu. You can either choose a filter that's added to Photoshop, or you can choose your own color. In this case, if I want to add a sepia color, I can just click on something in the color picker, say kind of a light brown, and click OK. And that's applied. Now you don't see it here for a couple of reasons. First of all, because when I selected the photo filter, you can see that I've put it underneath my gradient map. When I talked about layer order, this sort of thing is pretty important. Whenever you're toning an image, the toning layer needs to be up at the top. So I'm going to drag this all the way up to the top of my image. Okay, and now you can start to see a little bit of toning creep into the image. Not very much, it's very, very slight. The way to control the amount of toning with the photo filter adjustment layer is with this density slider here. The further you slide it to the to the right, the more color is going to be added to your image. Basically, the photo filter adjustment layer is similar to the kind of filters that people sometimes still do put on front of their lenses when they shoot. But nowadays, a lot of the stuff can be done digitally, so you don't necessarily need to have all those filters. But the way that this works, again, is to choose your color and then select the level of density. The higher the density, the more of a color effect that you get. Now, there's also this preserve luminosity checkbox at the bottom. And I don't ever uncheck it, and the reason why is because, like I said at the very beginning of the tutorial, when we're talking about toning, we don't want to alter the luminosity of the image at all. We don't want to play with the brightness at all because we've already done that. Preserving the luminosity, if this is checked, means that this layer is not going to touch the brightness at all. It's only going to affect the hue and the saturation. However, if I uncheck this box, all of a sudden it applies the filter and it uses the luminosity of this sort of orangish brown filter that I've got in place, and you can see that the image is darkened dramatically. Again, for that reason, I don't ever uncheck that. If I'm going to use this to tone an image, I always keep that box checked. Okay, so that's the first way that you can tone an image using the photo filter. I'm going to undo that now so that we can go into the next way, which is to use a hue saturation adjustment layer. Now, with the hue saturation adjustment layer, again, it's up at the top of my layer stack so that it's above my black and white conversion. All I have to do to use it to tone is to click the colorize checkbox here. At this point, it's going to tone it red because the hue slider is set to the red. If I want to tone it to a different color, let's say to a sepia or a kind of a brownish color, all I have to do is go in the hue slider here and move around to where I want that color to be. Then I can also alter the saturation, which is a little bit like the density slider on the photo filter. It pushes how much color is going into an image. The difference here is that with the hue saturation adjustment layer, you can go a much more intense with a color than you could with the photo filter. Okay, so you have the ability to go more intense, but you also have the ability to really kind of take it overboard. For me, looking at this now, this looks much too toned for me. I think that I would probably dial it back to somewhere like here if I was going to tone an image this way. But certainly, you can go all the way out to here if that's something that you want to do. Just be aware that moderation is best when you're toning a black and white image. You don't want to introduce a whole lot of saturation to it, because that kind of negates the reason why you would convert an image to black and white. Lightness, again, you can use, but to me, I don't want to affect the lightness. I really want to keep the lightness where it's at, because we've already dealt with the luminosity below, and once I get to toning, I'm not interested in altering the brightness of an image at all. The luminosity of the image, I want it to stay exactly where it is. And so for this particular adjustment layer, I would only be working on the hue, and I would only be working on the saturation. The hue to set my color, the saturation to determine the intensity of it. Okay, so these are the two adjustment layers that we've talked about so far for toning an image. Frankly, I don't use either of them. I've introduced them and I've talked about them just to give you a sense of exactly how they work, but there's a problem with these adjustment layers. Both of them will tone your image. However, they don't give you very much control over how the tone is applied. It's very indiscriminate. They simply tone everything. The highlights, the shadows, the midtones, everything gets toned, and you only have one color that you can use to tone that image. Okay? And so for doing my black and white toning, I can do it using these layers, these adjustment layers. However, I don't like to. The layer that works best, particularly within Photoshop Elements, where you don't have access to certain layers such as curves where you can do toning in that layer, is to actually use another gradient map. So if I go in here and I apply the gradient map, the first thing that you see generally when you apply a gradient map for toning is that it takes your image and it just completely wrecks it. In this case, it's set to white to black, so it's basically a negative image of what I've done before. If I go in here and I get off of that and I simply select a color that I'd want to tone it, let's say kind of a brown to approximate a sepia tone, even still here, what I'm getting is not very attractive. And the reason is because you simply have to change the blend mode. The blend mode is what's going to determine how this layer interacts with the layers below it. Because it's set to normal, it's simply applying a gradient the same way you would if you were, say, converting an image to black and white. The blend modes that I usually use when I'm applying a gradient map for toning are in this area here. Overlay and soft light are two of the particular ones that work really well. If I set it to overlay, it darkens it up a little bit. So there is a little bit of darkening going on, but it does a really good job of getting a very interesting color in there. Soft light is more of a overlay light, and so I do like this one as well, and I usually cycle between the two to see which one produces a better effect. But in this case, I think that I'd actually probably go with overlay here. I like the way it looks a little bit more. Now, once the blend mode is set to overlay, then I can come in here and really play around with what my colors look like. And because it's a gradient map, I have the ability to not just simply choose one color as I did with the hue saturation adjustment layer or the photo filter adjustment layer, where it's here's a sepia tone or here's a cyan tone or something like that. I have the ability to choose as many different color stops as I want, and so I can tone the shadows one color, and I can say come over here to tone the highlights a separate color. That's a little intense, but maybe something like that. But you have the ability to do a lot of different split toning techniques. Now, if you're using a program like Adobe Camera Raw for full Photoshop or Lightroom, there already is, and you probably already know about the split toning feature right within Lightroom or within Camera Raw. And you can certainly, again, use that to tone your image. I generally don't like to do that because you lack the control that you get, that you have here. With the split toning palette in Lightroom, you've got the ability to set two different tones, and you can set a balance between them, and you can set saturation and all that sort of stuff, but you can only set two. With the gradient editor, I can set as many as I want. So if I want to come in here and say, okay, I'm going to make that a much lighter color, I can do that. And then I can also adjust how, actually, there we go. Let's change it to something like that. I can also go in here and I can adjust how those two layers interact. Similarly, if I set this to white right here, then it's simply not applying any toning to this highlight up here. If I want that to carry over to more of the midtones, I can simply click on the diamond here in the color midpoint and drag it over to the left to do that. Okay. Finally, the other thing that I do when I tone my images, this to me right here, the way it is, it looks very, very intense. I like the kind of sepia color that's going on, but I don't like the intensity of it. And simply the way to get rid of that intensity is to take the opacity and just drag it over to where you think that the toning looks best. And so you've got a lot of control using the gradient map. You can control highlights, shadows, midtones. You can control different colors for different areas of your image, different brightness levels of your image. And by using the opacity slider and the blend modes, you can control how intense it is, and how much it will impact other parts of your image, like the luminosity. Okay, so this to me, in terms of toning an image within Elements certainly, but also to some degree within full Photoshop, this is really one of the better ways of toning your image, by using a gradient map. It's the same exact adjustment layer that we use to convert an image to black and white. The only difference is that you're setting the tones there and you're using a different blend mode and then changing your opacity to set it to taste. So that's it for toning images. Hope that you enjoyed the tutorial. Again, my name is Nick Marzinski at trappinglight.com. Thanks.